So why shouldn't you worry about making mistakes? Because they're part of the process of learning. You might as well worry about the sun coming up in the morning or going down in the evening. It's just what happens. There's nothing personal about it. It's an unavoidable part of the experience of drawing, of learning to draw. Can you imagine learning to play the piano and never hitting a wrong key, never producing a wrong note? Can you imagine learning to speak, say, French and always getting the correct gender with every noun every time from the word go? Can you imagine learning to drive a car without automatic transmission and never stalling, never jumping? Can you imagine learning to swim and your head never going underwater, never getting a mouthful of water? Or can you imagine learning to sing and every note that you hit in every song is always pitch perfect? No, of course not. It's ridiculous even to say these things. Then why are we so upset when we make mistakes, when we draw, when we put lines in the wrong place, or we do lines that don't have the effect that we were wanting them to have, or where we decide we made the line with the wrong pen, or whatever? Why do we get so upset when we draw about making mistakes? Why can this paralyze us so much that we actually don't draw? The fact that some of the notes might be wrong have never stopped me from singing, and I learnt to drive a car that didn't have automatic transmission, although I hopped all over the place for weeks. But it never occurred to me I wouldn't learn if I persevered. Making mistakes is all part of learning, and in almost every other area except drawing, we understand that. Mistakes don't tell us you'll never learn French or you'll never learn to play the piano or whatever. We accept they're part of the process. They're a reminder, sometimes a constant reminder, that we're still learning. So why then do we get so upset and so fearful of making a mistake when we draw? And I think part of the reason is that there is an element of drawing that is different to all of these other areas of learning. And that's that every line we draw stays on the paper. If I sing the wrong note, a moment later, no one can hear it except maybe in their memory, fading over time. But when I'm drawing, every line I place on the paper, if we're drawing in ink, as I do, will always remain. And so every time I look at that drawing, it looks up at me and says, what were you thinking? What on earth made you think you were going to be able to draw? And I suspect it's this permanence of every line that contributes to our fear of making mistakes. I need to embrace in my mind making mistakes as part of the learning process. But I think this next point will very much help us do that. So the second reason we shouldn't be so afraid of making mistakes is that they might just be telling us we've started, or at least at this point, we're in the wrong place for our drawing journey. A really common thing with people learning to draw, and it's very understandable, is that we want to start at the end. We've seen drawings that inspire us. We feel like we've got something inside of us to get out, and we feel like we've got the ability to do it. And so right from the start, we're wanting to produce drawings that look like the ones that have really inspired us. We possibly even buy expensive pens and expensive paper and even frames to put our artworks in. And we're thinking, I'm going to produce artworks. Now, if I'm producing an artwork, then every line will count. If something is going to end up in a frame on display, then there is pressure. The very worst drawings for an artist to draw are always commissions. They're ones where the buyer has paid for them in advance, and so there is that pressure. We have to get it right. There is not nearly the same enjoyment in a commission as in a drawing that I just do myself. But a big mistake is that when we're starting drawing, we can start at the end, or at least try and start at the end. We draw the subjects that excite us. If we love architecture, as I do, and like to draw it, then we don't start with a little cottage somewhere. We start with the Musée du Louvre because it's such an amazing building and we really want to be able to draw it. But the complexities and challenges of trying to draw the Musée du Louvre are a bit like starting to learn the piano with a Beethoven concerto. Yes, it's a beautiful piece of music, But if you try and start there, you will probably get discouraged because you're starting in the wrong place if you want to learn to play the piano. And so if we're making mistakes consistently and we're feeling overwhelmed by them, there's a very good chance it's an indication that where I'm pitching my drawing experience at this point is too far along. I need to come back to perhaps playing the scales more often, doing exercises, practicing drawing straight lines, practicing drawing lines that stop and start at a certain spot, practicing doing hatching for different objects, working out how I represent things such as foliage, not in a drawing with a beautiful building I've just drawn that has a tree next to it, but in little exercises where I just draw trees, things that I never expect to frame, things that I never expect to keep, things that I never expect even to show anyone. So I'm free to explore and to repeat, and if I find a technique that I like, I can use it over and over and refine it and become confident in using it. And I can do that very quickly when my trees are all grouped together in the one drawing. And if I don't like how it's looking, I can leave it straight away and try a new variation on what I was doing. And then when I do start to bring different elements together, perhaps how do I want to represent brickwork or stonework in a building? I do it with a cottage. I don't do it with grand imperial architecture. I do it where I have less things to juggle. And when I start to get these things correct, when my lines in these places tend not to be mistakes, then that's telling me I've hit a good spot right now for my drawing learning journey. So far from fearing mistakes, we should be looking out for them because they're a very good indication to us that we would progress faster in our drawing development if we moved back a little and worked on some simpler components and some simpler subjects. Our third reason not to fear making mistakes is that mistakes give us very precise information about where we need to focus our future drawing development. And especially if I'm a self-taught artist, then I need to map out what I need to do, what I should be practicing myself. I don't have a teacher who's already organized a comprehensive, systematized curriculum, or I don't have a teacher to point out areas that I may be weaker in my drawing that I can concentrate on. I need to sort it out myself. And if I'm not careful, I can spend a lot of time doing over and over again things that I don't really need to practice. But worse than that, I can spend that same length of time making my mistakes over and over again. And the more I make the same mistakes repeatedly, the more I tolerate making them, the more I get used to seeing them in my drawings because they're always there, the harder it's going to be for me eventually to see them, to actually think that anything's wrong with my drawing at all, which is why it can be very helpful to get another set of eyes, a good friend, a family member, and say, does anything look not quite right in this drawing? You don't even have to tell me what it is, but is there something that doesn't look quite right that you could kind of point out that I could go away and look at more closely? Because mistakes are wonderful indicators of where our focus should be. Now, after I complete my drawing, I need to be the teacher. I need to mark it. I need to get my red pen out and circle the areas that I can see aren't right, or that I know aren't what I was wanting to draw, or that my good friend or family member told me didn't look right. I need to get the red pen and circle things and then work out what the corrections should be. Sometimes it's very helpful to do the same drawing twice. Use the same reference a second time. I am always amazed when I've done this, how much further along I start the second drawing, even though there were things with the first drawing wrong enough that I wasn't satisfied with that drawing. But even so, when I do it again, I have a head start on so much that somehow it becomes easier then to focus on the things that I actually got wrong or didn't get happily drawn in the first one that I want to focus on. Critiquing our works is so important. We shouldn't be afraid of finding or recognizing mistakes because they're part of the learning process. They'll be there for everyone at a certain level of their drawing journey. Trees are often a problem for artists who draw. And if my tree canopies just end up tangled messes of lines, like a ball of wool that 10 cats have got stuck into playing, then that tells me I need to do some research to get some ideas and some thoughts and some direction about how do I draw foliage. I need to look at a wide range of artists whose drawings I like and work out how do they capture the effects of light on leaves. How do they capture the effect of depth, of roundness, or whatever shape the tree canopy is. And then I need to try and work that into my own drawing style and technique. If all my bare tree branches look like slithering snakes or a pile of wet noodles just sort of hanging limply, then I need to do some research about branches and trees and how they grow to understand the different types of branches that different types of trees have, what their process of growing is, and therefore how it affects the way they look as they get older and larger, longer and wider in their growth. The same way artists who drew the human figure would study anatomy. And if I'm unhappy with all my trees looking the same, regardless of whether they're a gum tree, a pine tree, an oak tree, a plane tree, then I need to do a little bit of work on what makes different trees look different. Again, I need to look at the work of other artists to get ideas, not to copy, but to get ideas that I can incorporate into my own thinking and drawing style. So I need to explore and focus on how different trees look and how I might represent that with my marks. And I need to practice that, just that, over and over again, drawing pine trees that look like pine trees. And hey, if this is an area that's of interest to you, I do have a How to Draw Trees playlist that I'll attach as a link to the end of this video. So we should never be afraid of making mistakes because they're a wonderful indication of how I can use my drawing time most efficiently. They show me where to focus, they give me direction, they fast track my improvement. And if I've gotten over the fact that when I'm learning to draw, I'm learning to draw, I'm not producing artworks, then I'm not worried about making the mistakes. They don't become a means of my telling myself I'm hopeless and can't draw. And I position myself now to benefit from the focus they give me. And this final reason why we shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes is so important and is something we need to keep reminding ourselves when we actually make the mistakes. And that's that mistakes never look as bad as when we first make them. That moment, the instant the line wobbles, the instant it veers off course so it's not going to line up with the other end of the line, when the curve is too sharp or too shallow, when we're drawing the horizontal line along the tops of the windows and we discover we've joined up the spaces between the windows instead. Am I the only person who does that? Feeling we have at that moment is not reflecting how important it's going to be what we've just done at the end of the drawing, or almost certainly not. Mistakes, or at least bad mistakes, seem to always happen in the early stages of the drawing. And I suspect there's two reasons for that. One is we're simply not so warmed up. Runners warm up their muscles so they can use them fully before they start racing. And in some ways, when we start to draw, we're still linking up our hand-eye coordination and all the other parts of the process that happen inside of us when we start to draw. And sometimes we're not doing that quite as well in the first few minutes as we will 5 or 6 minutes later on. And I think early in the drawing, we've drawn less, so we have less to reference our line work to. So therefore it's genuinely harder to judge proportion and direction because there's so much white paper. And so in some ways we're more likely to make a mistake in these more challenging first stages of committing ourselves on paper with our pen. And I think the very fact that there is so much white paper makes the few lines that we've drawn stand out more. And so if one of those lines isn't right, it has a larger impact with what we're seeing at that point than it will have at the end when all the other lines are there, not just as lines, but actually forming objects which will grab our attention ahead of any one line. So 2 thoughts about this. And the first is we need to tell ourselves it won't be so obvious at the end, that there will be a lot more line work and there'll be whole objects to look at from our line work. Our mistake line can hide among all the other lines in our drawing. So when I make a mistake, when I get that surge of disappointment, that rush of anxiety, that feeling of dread that I've spoilt it already, I need to say to myself, this is an overreaction. I know it won't be so bad. I just need to push through these feelings and get a few more lines on the page, and then it won't seem so bad. And secondly, and possibly more helpfully, is I need to realize that most lines that are incorrect can in some way be corrected, or at least distracted from. Almost every case where I draw the wrong line, I draw the correct line over the top. And that's because when we look at something, our brain judges very quickly, makes some very quick assessments of what it is and what it expects to see. And therefore it will favour those parts of the drawing, our lines, that are in the place it expects to see lines. So if I have a line for half of the dome, which is a little bit flat, and I draw a fuller, more correct line over the top of it, when our brains look at that dome, it will focus on the line in the correct place because that's what it needs to see. But if I only leave the incorrect line in place, then I have a dome that's not quite right. And when the brain looks at it, it says, oh, there's something not quite right there. That's not where I expect it to be. And so the overall impact is greater in most cases by leaving the incorrect line as the only line. More common for me though is where my perspective angle line isn't quite at the right angle. It either lifts up too much at one end or it doesn't go down enough at the other end. And I always draw the correct angle over the top. And often there are several lines close together at that point because of various architectural details and the angle with which we're looking at the building. And so my incorrect line is totally invisible usually at the end. But if I'd left that angle even slightly not right, it would have stood out amongst the other angles. So it's always worth correcting our incorrect lines. Sometimes we can adjust hatching. We can bring a dark tonal value up against an incorrect line, depending which side of the correct line the incorrect line's on. Or we can use hatching and shade or shadow to strengthen the correct line so that it looks even more correct and the incorrect line doesn't look as strong. I've been known to extend a tree slightly to cover a corner of a building that's not quite right. It all depends on the best option that we have in our drawing if we think something is really better off covered in some way. But you'd be surprised how much we can disguise or hide our incorrect lines. Another reason not to give in to that surge of adrenaline when we make them. Most of the time they're no big deal. G'day, I'm Travers. If you feel like you're always very apprehensive about making mistakes when you draw, or when you draw them, or when you make them you get very discouraged or upset and just want to abandon the drawing, I hope this has encouraged you to keep pushing on and to finish the drawing as best you can.